Hello, my lovelies, and welcome back to Bedtime Stories with Celosia Crane. I am back from my month of vacation, and we are ready to dive into another series of stories. This month, I'm going to be reading to you fairy tales from the Arabian Nights. Some of them you might be familiar with names, but it honestly is my hope, as it is every week, that I am introducing you guys to stories that you have not heard before. And this week we are going to start with the story Prince Ahmed and the Fairy. Prince Hussein would not honor the feast with his presence. He could scarcely endure to see the princess in the arms of Prince Ali, who, he said, did not deserve her better or love her more than himself. He left the court, and renouncing all right of succession to the crown, turned dervish, and put himself under the principal of a famous sheik, who had gained a reputation for his exemplary life, and had taken up his abode together with his disciples, whose number was great, in an agreeable solitude. Prince Ahmed did not assist at Prince Ali and the Princess Nouronnihar's wedding, any more than his brother Hussein, but did not renounce the world as he had done. He could not imagine what had become of his arrow, so he stole away from his attendants and resolved to search for it, that he might not have anything to reproach himself with. With this intention he went to the place where the Princes Hussein and Ali's were gathered up, and going straight forward from thence looked carefully on both sides of him. He went so far that at last he began to think his labor was in vain, yet he could not help going forward, till he came to some steep, craggy rocks, which would have obliged him to return, had he been ever so anxious to proceed. They were situated in a barren country, about 4 leagues distant from whence he set out. When Prince Ahmed came near these rocks, he perceived an arrow, which he picked up, looked earnestly at it, and was in the greatest astonishment to find it was the same he shot. "Certainly," he said to himself, "neither I nor any man living could shoot an arrow so far." And, finding it laid flat, not sticking into the ground, he judged that it had rebounded from the rock. "There must be some mystery in this," said he to himself again, "and it may be to my advantage. Perhaps fortune, to make me amends for depriving me of what I thought the greatest happiness of my life, may have reserved a greater blessing for my comfort." As these rocks were full of sharp points and crevices between them, the prince, full on these thoughts, entered a cavity, and looking about, cast his eyes on an iron door, which seemed to have no lock. He feared it was fastened, but pushing against it, it opened, and discovered an easy descent, but no steps. He walked down with his arrow in his hand. At first he thought he was going into a dark place, but presently a quite different light succeeded that which he had come out of. Coming upon a spacious square 50 or 60 paces distant, he perceived a magnificent palace. But he had not time to look at it, for at the same moment a lady of majestic air and of a beauty to which the richness of her clothes and the jewels which adorned her person added nothing, advanced as far as the porch, attended by a troop of ladies, of whom it was difficult to distinguish which was the mistress. As soon as Prince Ahmed perceived the lady, he hastened to pay his respects, and the lady, on her part, seeing him coming, was beforehand with him. Raising her voice, she said, "Come near, Prince Ahmed. You are welcome." It was no small surprise to the prince to hear himself named in a palace he had never heard of, though so near his father's capital. and he could not comprehend how he should be known to a lady who was a stranger to him. At last he returned the lady's salutation by throwing himself at her feet, and rising up again said to her, "Madam, I return to you 1,000 thanks for welcoming me to a place where I had reason to believe my imprudent curiosity had made me penetrate too far. But, madam, may I, without being guilty of rudeness, presume to ask how you know me, and why you, who live in the same neighborhood, should be so little known by me?" "Prince," said the lady, "let us go into the hall, and there I will gratify your request." After these words, the lady led Prince Ahmed into the hall, the noble structure of which, and the gold and azure which embellished the dome, and the inestimable richness of the furniture appeared to him so wonderful that he had never in his life beheld anything like it, and believed that nothing was to be compared to it. "I can assure you," replied the lady, "that this is but a small part of my palace, and you will say so when you have seen all the apartments." Then she sat down on a sofa, and when the prince at her entreaty had seated himself, she said, "You are surprised, you say, that I should know you and not be known by you, but you will be no longer surprised when I inform you who I am. You cannot be ignorant that the world is inhabited by genies as well as men. I am the daughter of one of the most powerful and distinguished of these genies, and my name is Pari Banu. Therefore I know you, the Sultan your father, the princes your brothers, and the Princess Nuronihar. I am no stranger to your love or your travels, of which I could tell you all the circumstances, since it was I myself who exposed for sale the artificial apple which you bought at Samarkand, the carpet which Prince Hussein met with at Bisnagar, and the tube which Prince Ali brought from Shiraz. This is sufficient to let you know that I am not unacquainted with anything that relates to you. The only thing I have to add is that you seem to me worthy of a still better fortune than that of marrying the Princess Nuronihar. I was present when you drew your arrow, and foresaw it would not go beyond Prince Hussein's. I took it in the air, and made it strike against the rocks near which you found it. It is in your power to avail yourself of this favorable opportunity." As the fairy Pari Banu pronounced these words, Prince Ahmed began to consider that the Princess Nuronihar could never be his, and that the fairy Pari Banu excelled her infinitely in beauty and agreeableness, and, so far as he could judge from the magnificence of the palace where she resided, in immense riches. "Madam," replied he, "should I, all my life, have had the happiness of being your slave, I should think myself the happiest of men. Pardon me my boldness, and do not refuse to admit into your court a prince who is entirely devoted to you." "Prince," answered the fairy, "as I have been a long time my own mistress, and am not dependent on my parents' consent, it is not as a slave I would admit you into my court, but as my husband, pledging your faith to me. I am, as I said, mistress here, and must add that the same customs are not observed among fairies as among other ladies." Prince Ahmed made no answer, but was so full of gratitude that he thought he could not express it better than by coming to kiss the hem of her garment. "Then," answered the fairy, "you are my husband, and I am your wife. But as I suppose," continued she, "that you have eaten nothing today, a slight repast shall be served up for you while preparations are making for our wedding feast this evening. And then I will show you the apartments of my palace, and you shall judge if this hall is the smallest part of it." Some of the fairy women who came into the hall with them and guessed her intentions immediately went out, and returned presently with some excellent meat and wine. When Prince Ahmed had eaten and drunk as much as he wanted, the fairy Pari Banu took him through all the rooms, where he saw diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and all sorts of fine jewels, intermixed with pearls, agate, jasper, porphyry, and all kinds of the most precious marbles. Not to mention the richness of the furniture. Everything was in such profusion that the prince acknowledged that there could not be anything in the world that could come up to it. "Prince," said the fairy, "if you admire so much my palace, which is indeed very beautiful, what would you say to the palaces of the chiefs of our genies, which are much more beautiful, spacious, and magnificent? I could also charm you with my garden, but we will leave that till another time. Night draws near, and it will be time for supper." The next hall into which the fairy led the prince, where the cloth was laid for the feast, was the only room the prince had not seen, and it was not in the least inferior to the others. He admired the infinite number of wax candles perfumed with amber, which formed an agreeable and pleasant sight. A large sideboard was set out with all sorts of gold plate, so finely wrought that the workmanship was much more valuable than the weight of the gold. Several beautiful women, richly dressed, whose voices were ravishing, began a concert, accompanied with all kinds of the most harmonious instruments he had ever heard. When they had sat down to table, the fairy Pari Banu took care to help Prince Ahmed to the most delicious meats, which the prince had never heard of, but found so nice that he commended them in the highest terms, saying that they far surpassed those among men. He found also the same excellence in the wines, which neither he nor the fairy tasted till the dessert was served up, which consisted of the choicest sweetmeats and fruits. After the dessert, the fairy Pari Banu and Prince Ahmed rose from the table, which was immediately carried away, and sat on a sofa with cushions of fine silk curiously embroidered with all sorts of large flowers at their backs, and a great number of genii and fairies danced before them. The days following the wedding were a continual feast, which the fairy Pari Banu, who could do it with the utmost ease, knew how to diversify by new dishes, new concerts, new dances, new shows, and new diversions, which were all so extraordinary that Prince Ahmed, if he had lived 1,000 years among men, could not have imagined. At the end of 6 months, Prince Ahmed, who had always loved and honored the Sultan his father, felt a great desire to know how he was. And as that desire could not be satisfied without his absenting himself to go and hear it in person, he mentioned it to the fairy and desired she would give him leave. This discourse alarmed the fairy and made her fear it was only an excuse to leave her. "My queen," replied the prince, "if you are offended at the leave I asked, I entreat you to forgive me, and I will make all the reparation I can. I did not do it with any intention of displeasing you, but from a motive of respect toward my father, whom I wish to free from the affliction in which my long absence must have overwhelmed him. Indeed, I have reason to think he believes me dead." "Prince," said she, "I am so fully convinced that I can depend upon your sincerity, that I grant you leave to go, on condition that your absence shall not be long." Prince Ahmed would have thrown himself at the fairy's feet to show his gratitude, but she prevented him. "Prince," said she, "go when you please, but first do not take it amiss if I give you some advice how you shall conduct yourself where you are going. First, I do not think it proper for you to tell the Sultan your father of our marriage, nor what I am, nor the place where you are settled. Beg him to be satisfied with knowing that you are happy, and that you desire no more, and let him know that the sole end of your visit is to make him easy about your fate." She appointed 20 horsemen, well mounted and equipped, to attend him. When all was ready, Prince Ahmed took leave of the fairy, embraced her, and renewed his promise to return soon. Then his horse, which was as beautiful a creature as any in the Sultan of the Indies stables, was brought, and he mounted him with an extraordinary grace, which gave great pleasure to the fairy, and after he had bid her a last adieu, set out on his journey. As it was not a great way to his father's capital, Prince Ahmed soon arrived there. The people, glad to see him again, received him with acclamations and followed him in crowds to the Sultan's palace. The Sultan received and embraced him with great joy, complaining at the same time with a fatherly tenderness of the affliction his long absence had been to him, which he said was the more grievous since a fortune had decided in favor of Prince Ali, his brother. He was afraid he might have committed some act of despair. "Sir," replied Prince Ahmed, "your Majesty knows that when I shot my arrow, the most extraordinary thing that ever befell anybody happened to me, that in so large and level a plain it should not be possible to find my arrow. Though thus vanquished, I lost no time in vain complaints, but to satisfy my perplexed mind, I gave my attendants the slip, and returned back again alone to look for my arrow. I sought all about the place where Prince Hussein and Prince Ali's arrows were found, and where I imagined mine must have fallen. But all my labor was in vain, until after having gone 4 leagues to that part of the plain where it is bounded by rocks, I perceived an arrow. I ran and took it up, and knew it to be the same which I had shot. Far from thinking your Majesty had done me any injustice in declaring for my brother Prince Ali, I interpreted what had happened to me quite otherwise, and never doubted but there was a mystery in it to my advantage, the discovery of which I ought not to neglect, but which I found out without going further from the spot. But as to this mystery, I beg your Majesty to let me remain silent, and that you will be satisfied to know from my own mouth that I am happy and contented. This was the only motive which brought me hither. The only favor I ask of your Majesty is to give me leave to come often and pay you my respects and inquire after your health." "Son," answered the Sultan of the Indies, "I cannot refuse you the leave you ask me, but I would much rather you would resolve to stay with me. At least tell me where I may hear of you, if you should fail to come, or when I may think your presence necessary." "Sir," replied Prince Ahmed, "what your Majesty asks of me is part of the mystery I spoke of. I beg of you to give me leave to remain silent on this head, for I shall come so frequently where my duty calls that I am afraid I shall sooner be thought troublesome than be accused of negligence in my duty." The Sultan of the Indies pressed Prince Ahmed no more, but said to him, "Son, I penetrate no further into your secrets, but leave you at your liberty. I can only tell you that you could not do me a greater pleasure than to come, and by your presence restore to me the joy I have not felt for a long time, and that you will always be welcome when you come." Prince Ahmed stayed but 3 days at the Sultan his father's court, and on the 4th returned to the fairy Pari Banu, who received him with great joy, as she did not expect him so soon. A month after Prince Ahmed's return from paying a visit to his father, as the fairy Pari Banu had observed that since the time that the prince gave her an account of his journey and his conversation with his father, in which he asked his leave to come and see him from time to time, he had never spoken of the Sultan, as if there had been no such person in the world, whereas before he was always speaking of him. She said to him one day, "Tell me, Prince, have you forgotten the Sultan your father? Do you not remember the promise you made to go and see him from time to time? For my part, I have not forgotten what you told me at your return, and put you in mind of it. Pay him another visit tomorrow, and after that go and see him once a month, without speaking to me or waiting for my leave. I readily consent." Prince Ahmed went the next morning with the same attendants as before, but much finer, and himself more magnificently mounted, equipped, and dressed, and was received by the Sultan with the same joy and satisfaction. For several months he constantly paid him visits, and always in a richer and more brilliant equipage. At last some viziers, the Sultan's favorites, who judged of Prince Ahmed's grandeur and power by the figure he made, abused the liberty the Sultan gave them of speaking to him, to make him jealous of his son. They represented to him that it was but common prudence to know where the prince had retired, and how could he afford to live at such a rate, since he had no revenue or income assigned him, that he seemed to come to court only to brave him, and that it was to be feared he might stir up the people's favor and dethrone him. The Sultan of the Indies was so far from thinking that Prince Ahmed could be capable of so wicked a design as his favorites would make him believe, that he said to them, "You are mistaken. My son loves me, and I am assured of his tenderness and fidelity. Be it as it will, I do not believe my son Ahmed is so wicked as you would persuade me he is. However, I am obliged to you for your good advice, and do not doubt that it proceeds from a good intention." The Sultan of the Indies said this that his favorites might not know the impression their hints had made on his mind. He was, however, so much alarmed that he resolved to have Prince Ahmed watched, unknown to his Grand Vizier. For this end he sent for a sorceress, who was introduced by a private door into his room. "My son Ahmed comes to my court every month, but I cannot learn from him where he resides, and I do not wish to force his secret out of him. But I believe you are capable of satisfying my curiosity, without letting him or any of my court know anything of the matter. You know that at present he is here with me, and is used to go away without taking leave of me or any of my court. Go immediately out on the road, find out where he retires, and bring me word." The magician left the Sultan, and knowing the place where Prince Ahmed found his arrow, went thither and hid herself near the rocks so that nobody could see her. The next morning Prince Ahmed set out by daybreak without taking leave either of the Sultan or of any of his court, according to custom. The magician, seeing him coming, followed him with her eyes, till all of a sudden she lost sight of him and his attendants. The steepness of the rocks formed an insurmountable barrier to men, whether on horseback or on foot, so that the magician judged that there were but two ways. The prince had retired either into some cavern or into some place underground, the abode of genies or fairies. When she thought the prince and his attendants were out of sight, she came out of the place where she had hidden herself, and went direct to the hollow where she had seen them go in. She entered it, and proceeded to the spot where it terminated in many windings, looking carefully about on all sides. But notwithstanding all her diligence, she could perceive no opening, nor the iron gate which Prince Ahmed discovered. For this door was to be seen by and open to none but men, and only to men whose presence was agreeable to the fairy Pari Banu, and not at all to women. The magician, who saw it was in vain for her to search any further, was obliged to be satisfied with the discovery she had made, and returned to give the Sultan an account. When she had told him what she had done, she added, "Your Majesty may easily understand, after what I have had the honor to tell you, that it will be no difficult matter to give you the satisfaction you desire concerning Prince Ahmed's conduct. To do this, I only ask time, and that you will have patience and give me leave to do it without inquiring what measures I intend to take." The Sultan was very well pleased with the magician's conduct, and said to her, "Do as you think fit, I will wait patiently." And to encourage her, he made her a present of a diamond of great value, telling her it was only an earnest of the ample reward she should receive when she had done him that important service, which he left to her management. As Prince Ahmed, after he had obtained the fairy Pari Banu's leave to go to the Sultan of the Indies court, never failed once a month, and the magician knew the time, she went a day or two before to the foot of the rock where she had lost sight of the prince and his attendants, and waited there with a plan she had formed. The next morning Prince Ahmed went out as usual at the iron gate with the same attendants as before, and passed by the magician, which he knew not to be such. Seeing her lie with her head on the rock, complaining as if she were in great pain, he pitied her, turned his horse about, and went and asked her what was the matter and what he could do to relieve her. The artful sorceress, without lifting up her head, looked at the prince and answered in broken words and sighs, as if she could hardly fetch her breath, that she was going to the city, but on the way thither was taken with so violent a fever that her strength failed her, and she was forced to stop and lie down, far from any habitation, and without any hope of assistance. "Good woman," replied Prince Ahmed, "you are not so far from help as you imagine. I am ready to assist you and to convey you where you shall not only have all possible care taken of you, but where you will find a speedy cure. Only get up and let one of my people take you." At these words, the magician, who pretended illness only to know where the prince lived, did not refuse the kind offer he made her so freely. And to show her acceptance rather by action than by word, she made many affected efforts to get up, pretending that her illness prevented her. At the same time, 2 of the prince's attendants alighted off their horses, helped her up, and set her behind another. They mounted their horses again and followed the prince, who turned back to the iron gate, which is opened by one of his retinue who rode before. When he came into the outer court of the fairy's palace, without dismounting, he sent to tell her he wanted to speak to her. The fairy Pari Banu came with all haste, not knowing what made Prince Ahmed return so soon. Not giving her time to ask him, he said, "My princess, I desire you would have compassion on this good woman," pointing to the magician, who was taken off the horse by 2 of his retinue. "I found her in the condition you see, and promised her the assistance she stands in need of. I commend her to your care, and am persuaded that you will not abandon her." The fairy Pari Banu, who had her eyes fixed upon the pretended sick woman all the time that the prince was talking, ordered 2 of the women who followed her to take her from the 2 men that held her, and carry her into the palace, and take as much care of her as they could. Whilst the 2 women executed the fairy's commands, she went up to the prince and whispered in his ear, said, "Prince, I commend your compassion, which is worthy of you, but give me leave to tell you that I am afraid it will be ill rewarded. This woman is not so ill as she pretends to be, and I am very much mistaken if she is not sent hither on purpose to cause you great trouble. But do not be concerned. Let what will be advised against you. Be persuaded that I will deliver you out of all the snares that may be laid for you. Go and pursue your journey." This discourse of the fairies did not in the least alarm Prince Ahmed. "My princess," said he, "as I do not remember I ever did or designed to do anybody any injury, I cannot believe anybody can have a thought of doing me one. But if they have, I shall not forbear doing good whenever I have an opportunity." So saying, he took leave of the fairy and set out again for his father's capital, where he soon arrived and was received as usual by the Sultan, who restrained himself as much as possible to disguise the trouble arising from the suspicions suggested by his favorites. In the meantime, the 2 women to whom the fairy Pari Banu had given her orders carried the magician into a very fine apartment, richly furnished. First they set her down upon a sofa with her back supported with a cushion of gold brocade, while they made a bed, the quilt of which was finely embroidered with silk, the sheets of the finest linen, and the coverlid cloth of gold. When they had put her into bed, for the old sorceress pretended that her fever was so violent that she could not help herself in the least, one of the women went out and soon returned again with a china cup in her hand full of a certain liquor, which she presented to the magician, while the other helped her to sit up. "Drink this," said she. "It is the water of the Fountain of Lions, and a sovereign remedy against all fevers whatsoever. You will find the effect of it in less than an hour's time." The magician, to dissemble the better, took it after a great deal of entreaty, as if she was very much averse to having it, but at last taking the china cup and shaking her head, as if she did great violence to herself, swallowed the liquor. When she had lain down again, the two women covered her up. "Lie quiet," said she who had brought the china cup, "and get a little sleep if you can. We will leave you, and hope to find you perfectly cured when we come an hour hence." The magician, who came not to act a sick part long, but only to discover Prince Ahmed's retreat and what made him leave his father's court, being fully satisfied in what she wanted to know, would willingly have declared that the potion had its effect then, so great was her desire to return to the Sultan and inform him of the success of her commission. But as she had been told that the potion did not operate immediately, she was forced to await the women's return. The two women came again at the time they said they should, and found the magician up and dressed and seated on the sofa. When she saw them open the door, she cried out, "Oh, the admirable potion! It has wrought its cure much sooner than you told me it would, and I have waited a long time with impatience, to desire you to take me to your charitable mistress to thank her for her kindness, for which I shall always be obliged to her. Being thus cured as by a miracle, I had rather not lose time, but continue my journey." The two women, who were fairies as well as their mistress, after they had told the magician how glad they were that she was cured so soon, walked before her and conducted her through several apartments into a large hall, the most richly and magnificently furnished of all the palace. Pari Banu was seated in this hall on a throne of massy gold, attended on each hand by a great number of beautiful fairies, all richly dressed. At the sight of so much majesty, the magician was so dazzled that after she had prostrated herself before the throne, she could not open her lips to thank the fairy as she proposed. However, Pari Banu saved her the trouble and said to her, "Good woman, I am glad I had the opportunity of obliging you, and to see you are able to pursue your journey. I will not detain you, but perhaps you may not be displeased to see my palace. Follow my women, and they will show it to you." The old sorceress, who had not power nor courage to say a word, prostrated herself a second time, with her head on the carpet that covered the foot of the throne, and so took her leave, and was conducted by the two fairies through all the apartments which were shown to Prince Ahmed on his first arrival there. But what surprised her most of all was that the two fairies told her that all she saw and admired so much was a mere sketch of their mistress's grandeur and riches, and that in the extent of her dominions she had so many palaces that they could not tell the number of them, all of different architecture, equally magnificent and superb. They led her at last to the iron gate at which Prince Ahmed brought her in, and after she had taken her leave of them and thanked them for their trouble, they opened it and wished her a pleasant journey. After the magician had gone a little way, she turned back again to observe the door and know it again, but all in vain, for, as was before observed, it was invisible to her and all other women. Except in this, she was very well satisfied with her work and posted away to the Sultan. When she came to the capital, she went by a great many byways to the private door of the palace. The Sultan, being informed of her arrival, sent for her into his apartment, and perceiving a melancholy look on her countenance, he thought she had not succeeded, and said to her, "By your looks, I guess that you have not made the discovery I expected from you." "Sir," replied the magician, "your majesty must give me leave to represent that you ought not to judge by my looks whether or no I have acquitted myself well as regards the commands you were pleased to honor me with. The melancholy you observe proceeds from another cause than the want of success." Then the magician related to the Sultan of the Indies the whole story of all that happened from beginning to end. When the magician had ended, she said, "What does your majesty think of these unheard of riches of the fairy? Perhaps you will say you rejoice at the good fortune of Prince Ahmed your son. For my part, sir, I beg of your majesty to forgive me if I take the liberty to say that I think otherwise, and that I shudder when I consider the misfortunes which may happen to you. And this is the cause of the melancholy which you perceived. I would believe that Prince Ahmed, by his own good disposition, is incapable of undertaking anything against your majesty. But who can say that the fairy, by the influence she already has over him, may not inspire him with a dangerous design of dethroning your majesty and seizing the crown of the Indies? This is what your majesty ought to consider serious and of the utmost importance. Though the Sultan of the Indies was very sure that Prince Ahmed's natural disposition was good, yet he could not help being uneasy at the remarks of the old sorceress, and said, "I thank you for the pains you have taken and your wholesome caution. I am so aware of the great importance it is to me that I shall take advice upon it." I promise you guys that is not the end of this story. However, we've already gone 35 minutes, and there is so much left to this story that I will pick it up again next week. Thank you for listening. Bedtime Stories with Celosia Crane is proudly produced by Lantern AudioWorks. Check out our merch store at lanternaudioworks.com to get yourself some sweet, sweet swag.